How do we practice and embody wisdom and kindness and goodness in the world? And how does this help to sustain the world? These are questions that I'm excited to explore with Debra Graugnard in this conversation about poetry and the practice of wisdom. Hi, I'm Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and I've spent the last 5 years, give or take 15, translating the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, or in short, the Kural. This is a book which is revered in the Tamil-speaking world and has been revered for 15 or more centuries from the time it was first written. It is an extraordinary guidebook to the practice of wisdom in everyday life, in the nitty-gritty of everyday life, from the life of a home to the life of a country to the life of the heart. And yet, this masterpiece of world literature, easily on par with books such as the Tao Te Ching or the poetry of Rumi, has remained not very well known in the English-speaking world, largely because there have been very few translations that really convey not only the wisdom, but the playfulness, the insight, and the layers of meaning that Thiruvalluvar as a poet is able to convey. And so, as a way of helping to introduce this work to people who are interested and in fact yearning for the kind of wisdom that the work has to offer, wisdom which I should note is astonishingly relevant because Thiruvalluvar has, among other things, a very deep ecological sensibility, a sensibility which seems all the more important now. As a way to introduce this work, I've been inviting other teachers, healers, spiritual leaders, and poets and translators to explore just a handful of verses, 2 or 3 verses from one of the chapters in the book, as a way to show how profoundly these verses can connect not only to our day-to-day experience, but to our deepest experience of goodness. So I am particularly delighted today to be in conversation with Debra Graugnard at Joyfully Living Wellness. I've known Debra for, I think, at least 8 years and have from the very beginning been impressed by her deep wisdom and her warmth of presence, and for the ways that she helps guide people into a deeper understanding of who they really are and what it means to embody love and compassion, right down, for instance, to our guts, right down to how we digest food and experience, which may be very savory and which may at times seem to be quite horrific, and yet can reveal extraordinary gifts when we learn how to discover them. So I am delighted to introduce to you Debra Graugnard.
Thank you so much, Tom. I am honored that you have invited me to be here and to share in this discussion with you. I am excited to see how it unfolds and where it goes for us, and for all who are listening and partaking in this. I want to just take a minute and honor you for what you have put together in this translation. It is astonishing. It is beautiful, and just the pieces that I've had the opportunity to explore, my heart just feels like a garden, just flowering, flourishing with beautiful, fragrant wildflowers. And I know that this work that you have put so much of yourself into, it's like your fragrance comes through in it, along with the ancient wisdom and beauty that is inherent in the work itself. So I could not think of a better person to do this work that you're doing. And again, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm very touched and moved to hear that. And I love this image of a garden. because there is a way in which this book, which is comprised of some very short verses, 1,330 of these very short verses, arranged into particular topics, is like a garden, an abundance of a garden with flowers of all kinds. And like any large garden, there will be little groves which are simultaneously their own grove and a reflection of the whole. And so what I've done is I've shared with Debra one of the 133 chapters in this book, a chapter called Having Kindness. It's the 100th chapter in the book. And it's from there. The book is divided into three parts, the first being virtue, the second being wealth and power, and the third being love. And so this comes from the section, interestingly enough, on wealth and power. So I've shared chapter 100, Having Kindness, with Debra. And so to start off our delving into this garden, let's choose a single flower. I'm curious, Debra, the first time you read this chapter, if there was any verse in particular, or maybe a handful of verses that just sort of stood out to you, maybe in a grand way or maybe in a very subtle way. What caught your attention?
That is a very good question, and there were a few in here. Is it the very first verse? From openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily. That right there says so much. And if you would like to read it in the metric, the rhythm that it's to be read, or even in its original language, I offer you that opportunity.
I would love that. Let me
Awesome.
I'll
There's
share it
something
with
about having when, and I imagine, I feel that I'm going to butcher it, Tamil is a sacred language, and to have something spoken in its sacred language brings a vibration, a transmission, a rhythm that our souls and our spirits, right? And this, this kindness is breath of spirit embodied, right? And so to have it read in its original language and in the way that it was written, I think, and maybe can put an invitation here to allow us to listen from our hearts and our souls and allow the rhythms to harmonize with what you're about to share.
I'm always so delighted to share these verses in the original. In fact, I have here the copy of, let me see if I can hold this up to the camera. This is the copy that I read with my Tamil teacher in Tamil Nadu. You can see that it is well loved and the binding has long since fallen off, and I have to keep it in a little a special case so that it doesn't get too mangled. But this first verse, what I'll do is I'll share the verse in English in the translation, and then I'll share the Tamil so you can hear what the original language sounds like, and then I'll share the verse in English again. And I really invite you who are listening to just let, especially the first time listening even to the English, to really just let the sounds of the words sink in, the rhythm of the words, which is what, of course, you can do with the Tamil, especially if you have no idea what the words mean, because there is something being imparted beyond the quote-unquote meaning of the words. There is something in the rhythm of the words and the sounds of the words, the vowels and consonants and their play together, that is as much a part of the meaning of the poem as its quote-unquote meaning, the way we might pull meaning from it. So here is verse, this is verse, it's the first verse in chapter 100, Having Kindness, and it's the 991st verse in the entire book. From openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily. Yanbadatal yedal yalidenba, yarmartum panburima yennum varak. From openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily. And because I have the tummer right here, I wanted to point out something that I point out in the commentary to these poems in the back of the book, which is that the word I've translated as kindness has at its root an understanding of the kind of being we may be, or maybe even a better way to put it would be our deepest nature, our truest nature. And in fact, this is something that is hidden as well in English. We hear the word kindness, and our sort of surface associations may be of a kind of niceness, or more fully understood, a graciousness, an openness to people. But kindness too has to do with the kind of being that we are. Kindness too has to do with our own deepest nature. And so there is, interestingly enough, in both the Tamar and in English, the understanding of kindness and the possibility of kindness being rooted in the core of our being, the nature of who we actually are, and how that rootedness and that trueness to kind, that trueness to nature, then leads quite naturally into a kind of openness, into a kind of graciousness at the deepest levels. So I'm curious, Deborah, what struck you about these lines, and continuing this image of a flower. We might even imagine, now that we're looking at the flower, and we might even start to notice the particular petals, particular words, particular phrases, or anything that stands out to you.
Yes. Tom, I thank you so much for that, because it really does just deepen, and especially that rephrasing of the way that we defined kindness. What I think, if you want to compare to the flower, what stands out for me the most is the fragrance, because what stood out for me in this verse is just that, the from openness to all people, openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily. And that the word of openness, as human beings, we're here on this planet Earth, which full of its, highs and lows, and all of those things. We have a tendency to walk around with barriers for protection. And a lot of times when we see someone that we don't know, the first thing that comes up is the walls of protection, which tends to close things down. And so before we extend kindness and openness, before we can be open to extend the kindness, our nature at times, I don't think it's the deepest nature, but our human nature that's here for survival, will put up those walls. So the word openness, and that really stood out for me. And when that openness is there, and we can extend to the people, just be with the people, open to the people. What is a people? What is a person? What is a human being with life force, but a presence of kindness and grace on the planet in visible form that we can see? Because what is a human being? A life force embodied, but the presence of the breath of spirit. And in my belief, anyway, it is breath of spirit that gives life to the physical body. When the breath of spirit leaves the body dies. It's mentioned later about men are blocks of wood, right? I mean, what are we without breath of spirit? And so when we are open to each other, letting go of the ego nature of that, protection, survival, which, has its place, right? It has its place. But when we can let that go and be open to the people, we can extend breath of spirit to breath of spirit. we can come into a relationship in that way. And that kindness, that grace can meet that kindness and that grace that's in front of us. And what a beautiful thing, and what a beautiful world. I mean, that can be created from that. And when I think of that breath of spirit that breathes forth from a living being, that's what gives life force and consciousness and moves us and breathes us and exudes from us through our presence. And when my presence meets your presence, that breath that breathes through is like the fragrance of the flower that can be then absorbed by the senses of the other. And when we set our intention in kindness to meet kindness, meeting kindness, we can tune into the fragrance that exudes from the other and share in that kindness, from grace to grace, from life force to life force, from source to source. And there's an incredible beauty in that.
It is, yeah, it is an extraordinary beauty. And it occurs to me to add at perhaps another level of this is that in Tamar, and I'm so glad that I got to share the poem out loud, because in Tamar, the word for vowel is life letter, breath
Oh, I love it.
letter. So vowels, and this is actually our physical embodied experience, that to make a vowel we have to breathe. we breathe our breath into every vowel we speak. I think that's why the sound ah, right? The ah of breath, the ah of surprise, of delight, of an aha moment, if you will, is also the same ah, which is that same sound which we find in sacred names for the divine in traditions around the world. And in fact, the very first verse of the Kural, invokes the sound of that first letter, which in Tamar was also ah. And then the consonants, the term that the grammarians, that the great Tamar grammarians gave to consonants, are body letters, letters of the body. So even in a poem, even in speaking out loud, there is an understanding that we are infusing the body of consonants, which are formed by our physical body, with our living breath. And that's how a poem which may have been written, 15 centuries ago, we can, by filling it with our own breath, we are, in a way, we are meeting, as you were describing, we get to meet also the breath of the poet. We get to meet also the breath of a living tradition, a living language. We get to meet the breath, in some ways, of our own deepest selves. And that when this when we are as open to this as we can be, that it's a transformative experience. I don't, I think one of the strange things about growing up in North America is that poetry is seen as a kind of obscure, strange thing that you might study in school, but that is kind of an extra, a kind of not really all that important, but a nice thing. Whereas I think the great poets have all understood, and in fact whole civilizations have understood, that poetry is at the heart. It is one of the ways that we can encounter this deepest source of our experience, of our being, and of our breath, and of our bodies. So I'm so grateful for that reflection on breath and on the possibility of really encountering, really being open to another person.
Yes. And I am grateful for that lesson that you just shared about the consonant and the vowel. And I don't know if you know, but one of my most favorite things is the study of sacred language and the meanings of the vibrations, the meanings that are associated with the vibrations that are created as when word is spoken, when that breath is shared, and the energies that are formed and what that means in the created world. And so, and how that is bringing the creation of manifestation of source, emanation of God consciousness into the material realm and into creation. And so that's one of my favorite studies. So having you share that just added to that. Thank you.
So lovely. I can't resist saying one last thing about this verse, which is that even as I was studying and translating it, part of my practice of translating this particular verse was deepened by my conversations with Sufis, and I neglected to mention at the beginning of this conversation that Debra is a master healer and spiritual teacher in the Shadaliya Sufi tradition, and through her and through some of her colleagues, I've encountered the wisdom of a tradition that I knew very little about. And what really stands out to me with this verse is that, in my understanding of the 99 divine names of God, of Source, one of those names is the one who opens, the opener. And in fact, I also understand that the Quran begins with a verse which is also uses the root of that same word. So that the first verse is the opening verse, the Fatiha, which I've probably mispronounced. But my understanding is that quality of openness as a divine quality, that as human beings we can partake of, we can open ourselves to, um, uh, is and I'll add here also that my experience of that quality is also enriched by I grew up going to a Christian church, and the preacher, the minister at our church once preached a sermon which I still remember. I must have been 10 or 11 years old, where he quotes Jesus, who used a word with the same root in Aramaic, and it's Jesus is doing a healing, and he says, be opened. Ephata, I think, is the Aramaic.
Oh,
Be
yes.
opened. And so that, that root, the Sufi understanding of Fatah, al Fatah, the one who opens, all of those were playing in me as I was translating and meditating on this particular verse. And I mention that not only because I think it's interesting, but also to try to give a little taste, or to share a little bit of the fragrance for how this poet and how this book of poems, using a line and a half of poetry, is able to invoke all of these things that we've been discussing. And I think that's one of the characteristics of sacred language. And I think further that one of the great secrets, and one of the great secrets that poets know, is that all language is sacred language, except that we forget it, or we've never learned to see it, or language has been desecrated by how it's being used in culture, in politics, or economics. But that at its heart, every living language is a living sacred language. And when we are, to use this word again, open to it, we can be absolutely astonished by what we discover. So I don't know if that prompts any further reflections, but that did occur to me to say.
Yeah. Beautiful. It does actually prompt the question that I had about another verse. So yeah, the next one down. Did you want to share it? Were you going to?
Sure. Let me share the verse, and I'll share it again in the English, and then in the Tamil, and then in the English, and then I'll be very curious to hear your question. I suspect it's in fact a question that I wrestled with greatly in translating this verse, and in fact, there's a whole chapter in the book which corresponds to a key idea in the verse. So this is the second verse in chapter 100, having kindness. Love in one's heart and birth in good family together are the way of kindness. Anbudemayantra kudi. I'm going to do that again. Anbudemai andra kudi pirattal ivrandum panbudemai ennum varakku. Love in one's heart and birth in good family together are the way of kindness.
Yeah. So, my question, what does that mean, birth in good family?
This is, in fact, the very question that I spent a great deal of time wrestling with, because it is very easy to read that as saying, you better get born in a good family or you're screwed. I mean, a kind
Is
of
it hopeless for me? Am I not going to be a kind person?
yes. Um, and I think that the verse has been interpreted that way, but I don't think that it's actually what the verse is telling us. And here's why: because this idea of birth in a good family, the word that Thiruvalluvar uses is kudi, and that can mean family, but everything really hinges on what it means to be born in a family. If we are stuck in a kind of literalism, we think, oh, somebody is physically born into X, Y, or Z family, and that family may have X, Y, or Z issues to deal with. A person may be orphaned or suffer any number of traumatic experiences, and then there is a kind of fear that such a person would be forever doomed or fated to having not had that peace. So how can they become loving and kind and so on if life has been apparently so cruel to them? But here is the thing: in the Tamar, this word kudi does not mean what we often think of as a family, meaning a mother, a father, and maybe a couple siblings. And in fact, the word family in English hasn't always meant that. This idea of the nuclear family is an astonishingly new idea and new experience, because kudi refers to a much larger sense of family. It refers to an extended family. It refers to the extended family and community of people who are interrelated by their relationships with each other and with the place or places in which they dwell. And so what I have come to in my understanding of the Kural and of this verse, and of there is an entire chapter in the Kural which is on family, on being born in a good family, is that uh, just as we have our birth families, we also have families that we choose. We have families that we choose through our associations with people, through being blessed with teachers, through being blessed with friends, through, paradoxically enough, being blessed with enemies and discovering ways to see how they may not, in fact, even be our enemies. All of these things, all of our relatedness, and the continual process of being born, that it's
Yeah.
not as if birth is a one-time event back in the past and is somehow unchangeable. But even just at a physical level, we can, the body is constantly renewing itself. We're constantly shedding skin cells, to take just one of many, many examples, as we're regenerating or generating a new skin cells, a new, this is true of all of the organs in the body, so that there is the continual possibility of being continually born. And that part of this continually being born has to do with the families the given family that we say yes to wholeheartedly, and the chosen family that we learn to be family to. That I think that this verse is turning our attention toward, to the communal aspect, to what the many Buddhist traditions would call the Sangha, the community that we consciously surround ourselves with, and the ways that we create these interrelationships with other living beings. And so there's the love in one's heart the verse speaks about, and there's how we intertwine that love in our heart with the love of the people and the animals and the world and the earth around us. That's how I've come to understand that verse.
That is absolutely beautiful, and I'm going to read it again. Would you like to read it out loud again now that you've explained that, and let us take that in?
Love in one's heart and birth in good family together are the way of kindness.
Okay, now I can take that in a whole different way of that actually gives limitless possibility of rebirth and rebirth and rebirth into more and more grace and kindness.
Yeah.
It was
And even,
beautiful.
I'm glad to have the original text right here, because the word that Tiruvallur uses for birth is actually a verbal noun. Another birthing would be one way we could birthing in a good family.
Mm,
The action of being born. So just as we can think of openness as a continual process, as a
mm,
continual opening and opening and opening. We can think of birth as a continual birthing, as a continual allowing to be born into the world, allowing ourselves to be born into the world, allowing ourselves to bear and carry the love into the world that we bear in our hearts.
yeah, that is absolutely beautiful. Beautiful being just, with and this sparks even more of that as we carry more kindness in our bodies and in our lives and in our hearts, and we share that in the world, we are giving birth to and rebirth to ourselves over and over again. And beautiful.
Beautiful. Are there? I'm just curious if there were any other verses from this chapter that that stood out to you. I mean, this has already been such a rich dialogue, and in some ways, it hasn't been so much a dialogue as a, to coin a term, a trialogue, because we get to be in conversation with each other, but we're also in conversation with Tiruvallur. And in fact, we are
It's
also
beautiful.
in conversation with our languages and our traditions and the different things that feed into us. We are, in a sense, creating or invoking our own particular kind of family around this conversation, which I think all good conversation does. It becomes a kind of convocation, a bringing
Mm,
into presence, into centered presence, the intermingling voices of many many beings, many worlds, many traditions. So is there any other verse that you'd want us to take a look at?
yes, if we can do one more, the very last one. And,
Ah,
I know one had stood out for me. And then, excuse me, when you mentioned, and I apologize, I failed to recognize that it was in the section on wealth and power. But then looking at this very last verse about riches attained by those without kindness, like milk soured by its jug.
so here's the English again. This is verse 1000, the 10th of the 10 verses in the chapter having kindness. Riches attained by those without kindness, like milk soured by its jug. Panbilan Petra Perenselvam, Nanpal Kalanti Mayal Tirindatre. Riches attained by those without kindness, like milk soured by its jug.
Mm.
The verse actually has there's an adjective I couldn't get quite into the rhythm of the English. Good milk. The idea is that this is pure milk, sweet milk, healthy from the healthiest of cows and fields milk, milk of human kindness. And even this great thing gets soured by its container, by by what happens when it's placed into a context which is inimical to it. Um, and I have actually all sorts of things I could say about this verse, but tell me more about what stood out to you.
That exactly what you just said is, the milk being like, just the nourishment that riches can bring, that, that riches, when I think of riches of being like the true riches is the resources that are here to feed us and to nourish us and to sustain us on every level. And that nourishment, when we uh, and maybe I'm reading that into it, attained by those without kindness, my mind instantly goes to that which is stealing without respect to others, taking in a way that is unkind, that is hoarding, that is, that becomes a form of greediness that really kind of perpetuates a culture of lack and unkindness, not sharing, not caring for each other, but a fear-based um, or that which comes from a need for dominance and control, which is so prevalent in our world right now. It's a big struggle. And the nourishment, and I want to say it this way because riches, so often we think of as money. We think of as money, we think of as attaining material things, of owning property. And as you know, I've been working on a book as well that is about love in the era of peace and the era of compassion. And how can we, as beings of this life force of grace and kindness, claim to own that which the Creator gives to the world to sustain all of life and the planet itself and our home? And so when we seek to attain the riches and to accumulate masses without kindness, which to me means at the expense of others without wanting to care for others, then the container in which that wealth is stored becomes that which sours the riches, the milk itself, that nourishment, that which sustains, and the life force, which we can use as a means of loving and caring and showing kindness and compassion, becomes soured. So I felt that, I know in reading the introduction of the book, and it was talking about how relevant this is from centuries ago, how relevant it is today. And that was one of the things that really stood out for me. It's a reminder of what is milk, what is riches, what is wealth. And I'm sure you can say a lot more about this, having gone through the whole section on wealth and power. But to me, it is that which is given freely and not to be owned selfishly without love and kindness and compassion for each other.
I think that's so true and so beautiful and so, as you say, relevant. Elsewhere in this second, which is the largest of the longest, the most sizable of the three sections of the book, there's a series of verses which basically make very clear that wealth is not just money or its equivalent. There is the wealth of learning. There is the wealth of kindness. There's the wealth of, indeed, of generosity. And so here too, you can see how, a single verse is actually, rippling out, resonating out in dialogue with all of these other voices and verses in the book and beyond the book. And along with that, there is something interesting, which is that we saw this question of family arise. And in fact, the first of the three parts of the book, or the three books, depending on how you name them, is about virtue, but particularly the home life. The home, what does it mean to live in the home? And there's a section in there on renouncers, because there is also an interest and a place for those who say no for deep spiritual reasons to a settled home life and live a different kind of ascetic or renunciance life. However, the vast majority of verses in the book is interested in this question of a grounded and rooted life, the home life, and then by extension in the largest of the three sections. Part two, the life of the wider community, of the kingdom, or of the political community. And so a lot of the verses in this part two are addressed to leaders. What does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to have advisors? What does it mean to learn in a way that befits a leader, to listen in a way as befits a leader? And with this, and what does it mean to have, what is wealth? What is the wealth of learning? And what is material wealth, which is as important as the wealth of learning? And so this verse, coming back to this verse, there is a wonderful, a kind of corresponding hidden image, which is that if we think of riches attained by those without kindness being like milk soured by its jug, well, then we can also imagine, we're also invited to imagine, what does it mean to attain riches of all kinds with kindness? What would that do to that milk? If a jug could sour milk, what would that container of kindness do to that same quality, to that same potential, to that same deep nourishing substance?
That's a beautiful thought.
Yes.
This brings up beautiful imagery.
Here too, we can see how, a verse is a kind of commentary on itself. And a verse is a kind of commentary, or the other verses in this particular work are all commenting on each other. They're in this dialogue. And that when we get to enter into dialogue, conversation with a work of this kind, we also get to enter into this conversation of voices within ourselves, with other people, with this great poet from the past who is clearly very much still alive. And so as we bring our conversation, maybe I won't say a close, because I hope our conversation will continue, but we bring this part of our conversation to a close. I'm curious, Deborah, if you had any questions you wanted to ask me about the process of translating this book, or about the book itself, or about the poet. Is there anything that occurs to you to ask?
Oh, I would love to know. I mean, I think when we met, you were studying with, and I don't want to butcher his name. Can you say his name, Dr.?
Dr. Ramakodi.
Thank you. You were studying with him, and you had started, or you were on this process, right, of really learning and studying this book and the translation of it with him. And how has this changed your life?
That's a wonderful question. And I'll just, as far as, so I was working very intently with Dr. Ramakodi, who was a very cherished and is a very cherished teacher to me. And this whole translation is I even dared, I didn't even think to do it. I didn't even dare to do it. For many, many years. I first sort of began studying it intently all the way back in 2003 and 2004, and then would sort of touch in with it since that time. And my teacher would suggest that maybe somebody should do a proper translation of this book. And I think, yeah, that'd be a great thing for somebody to do. And for whatever reason, it wasn't until 2016 that I suddenly thought, well, maybe I'll give it a try. And when I told my teacher this on the phone, a couple weeks later, I'd started doing sort of as part of my daily writing practice. Every morning I would translate or attempt to translate one of these poems. And I told him, and he said, oh, you finally got the hint, which was so interesting because he was never one to, he was always very forthright about what he thought I should or shouldn't do. But I think he understood that you couldn't tell someone to translate a book like this. Either it would occur to me naturally or it wouldn't. But what was really beautiful about this process is that after I had completed maybe it was a third or fourth draft, I had the opportunity to go back to South India to live with my Tamil teacher for one last summer, and to go over the entire translation with him. And by this time, he was well into his 80s. And in fact, when I was working on the translation, he would say, I'm not a spring chicken anymore. Basically the Tummer equivalent, which doesn't have spring chickens in it. But he let me know that if I wanted him to read my translation, I would have to get it to him. And so we were able to bring this to a kind of fulfillment. He was able to read the entire book. Now, there's a caveat, which is that because we went into such great depth, I thought we had studied the book and that I was just translating it. But this process of going through this draft of my translation proved to be an extraordinary deepening to seeing things I hadn't seen before, and then having to find some way to at least suggest some of those things in English. And so we only got through the first 90 or so books. And, before I went back to be with him, I thought, well, maybe we could talk on the phone, or maybe we could even do a video call. And he was quite adamant that no, I had to get myself back there. And he was right, because I did have to get myself back there for the leisurely kind of conversation that we needed to have sitting in his house, really spending time with these verses. But having had that, and then when I had to return because of other obligations that I had, he said, okay, well, we have to finish this. So we actually embarked on a daily Zoom call or Skype or whatever it was we used, one of these video conferencing platforms. And so he was able to read through to the very end, and I was able to go through and to listen to all of his critique and occasional praise, but a lot of pushing, pushing of the very best kind to make the translation as good as it could possibly be. And so we were able to finish that. And in fact, I remember talking with him on the phone. I would in the process, in the middle of this, I did a whole nother revision of the verses he hadn't yet gotten to. And then I sent him those verses, and he commented on them, and then he sent them back to me in the mail, and I'd read his comments, and then we would finally discuss this on the video call. On the day that he read the last chapter, he said to me on the phone, we got to the last chapter, and I realized I feel a little sad. And I could feel that because there was, we had been on this adventure. I mean, not just the adventure of working on the book together, but, all of those years that he was hoping the idea might occur to me, that there was a great poignancy there. And I'm extraordinarily grateful that it happened before he died, because he died maybe a year or so later. My fantasy, of course, would be that the book would have been out. He would have had a chance to see it. That's not how life has unfolded. And yet, in a way, that is how it has unfolded. And there's a sense of having come not quite full circle, but to the fruition that comes from a fulfillment, the fruition that comes from having been open to something and having that openness be filled, if that makes any sense. And so,
Absolutely.
there's a way in which, every time I get to speak about this work, my teacher is present with me, and he is still teaching me. And I get to become something of the teacher that he was for me. And that's very humbling and moving to me. And so that's one of the many ways in which working on this has deeply changed my life.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is absolutely beautiful. When I just, in witnessing from afar, witnessing what appears as your surrender into this process and into, a devotion for this work and for bringing the poetry and the message to life in this day and time, in this point in time in our world, is just, I love hearing what you said about what it gave to you, because isn't that like when we surrender to something that calls us deeply from deeply inside, right? No one gave it to you, but someone definitely held the space and waited for you to hear the call from within yourself. And when you did, and when you surrendered to that process, then, look, as you say, the fruition of the fulfillment that came through. And that's a beautiful spiritual teaching in and of itself that you just shared there. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for.
It's quite inspiring and moving in so many ways. I
Well, thank you
always feel
for
when I spend time with you.
ah, well, thank you for asking the question and for offering the space in which to answer it. Um, that's what we get to do for each other in true conversation. We get to help each other hear our own hearts more fully and hear them echoing and reverberating in our own experience. Well, this has been such a deep pleasure and an honor and a privilege. For those of you listening, I invite you, if you're interested to learn more about Debra's extraordinary work, please do visit her website, joyfullylivingwellness.com. She has an abundance of resources available. She has a podcast, she has blogs, she has different kinds of programs, a healing circle. So if you are drawn to what Debra is saying and to what she has to offer, please do learn more about her work. And if you're interested in reading the Kural for yourself and to exploring how these verses might speak to your own heart and your own experience, the book comes out January 11th, 2022. It's currently available for pre-order. You can pre-order it through my website, thomaspruiksma.com. And then after the 11th of January, it should be available anywhere that good books are available. And if it's not, please ask for the book so that people who are searching for it may find it. So thank you again, Debra. Um, see if there's any last words you want to say before we close our conversation.
I want to say thank you. I do pray that this book reaches the hearts and souls of as many people as it's meant to reach. And I pray that's a lot. And I thank you. The honor and privilege has been mine to be here to discuss this with you. I wish that we could go verse by verse and spend an hour on each one. That would be a blast. But I am grateful for this. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who has been joining us with your ears and your hearts. All good wishes to all of you.